Yep, I know. Hi. Hi, I'm back again. Um, yeah, I'm gonna be a little more relaxed. Well, as relaxed as I can be while setting up. Um, so yeah, I'm hoping everyone was at least kind of enjoyed the first part of it. One of the feelings I got from it was it felt very like an old western. So I'm kind of excited about that. This time around, though, I actually know what happens, so for me, it's not me discovering with you, which I know kind of takes a little bit out of it. Don't worry, the next one I'm going to be doing next month will be completely new for both of us. The only thing I do know, I have one thing, but I'm going to wait until I'm done reading, and then I'll ask if anyone if anyone notices anything, or I may just if it's really blatantly obvious, then everyone can kind of go what, and I'll be like, I know. Anyway, neither here nor there. So I'm here again with more chapters. Like I said, because it's so small, I'm just going to read a bunch of chapters all at once, and that'll take us through until Thursday. And then I will probably do a preview on Friday. So just bear with me while I get ready. What I should have gotten ready before I started the stream. You know, these things happen. And with me, they always happen. So, I mean, if you're expecting, a consummate professional, see, no, that's not me. That's not me. This is me practicing, trying to talk in front of people, and that's what this is. That and also reading this to see what I think of it. Although in this case, I kind of already know. I'm really, really sad that this isn't complete because I really like the world. I really like, and I know that I showed you guys the map. I just haven't had a chance to get it to where I need it in order to publish it yet. So that's something that's going to have to wait until a little bit later, maybe like uh, a different edition of the book. But yeah, then I know I was showing you the map, getting everybody all excited about it. I wanted it to be in there, but I had to make an executive decision, and it was going to take me a lot longer. I mean, I'm still going to work on it. It's not going to be ready right away. And I have so many books to work on. So many books to work on that I need to like just kind of put things out as I can. There will come a time, like this is not the rest of my life kind of thing where I'm putting out books. Well, yes, but the the rest of the life will be doing all the unfinished books and then working on finishing all the books that aren't finished already. So, without further ado, I'm going to just get right to the story because you're not here to listen to me babble. You're here to hear a story. Okay, so as you noticed, it's a two POVs, yeah, and so this one is chapter 4, Jakath. He put on his no-nonsense stride about 3 steps before he rounded the corner, and there indeed were Annalise and the master. He suspected that that Lanathan was giving some last-minute instructions, including just how much to trust his bodyguard. He noted the pack horse and carefully erased all expression from his face. He wasn't going to get into a discussion with the two of them, but he certainly would talk to Annalise once they'd gotten out of the city. He wasn't so much of a fool to believe he'd been hired just as a bodyguard to a boy with a message, but it might be useful to find out just how much they were carrying. He thought briefly of the possibility of lifting the lot, but Lanathan was just the sort to have connections throughout the kingdom, and to have anyone who stole from him tracked down, even if they went to the furthest reaches of Shandakar. He came into speaking distance. "Good morning, sir. Good morning, Anless." They both returned the greeting. Then Lanathan went on to say, "Here is your horse, Jakath. I'm lending him to you for the duration of the job. And here's your wages, half now as we agreed. And Anless, here's some money for your supplies you'll be needing. I suggest you let Jakath give you some advice on just what you need." Analyst nodded, tucking the small pouch into his wallet. Jakath noted approvingly that he was dressed for riding, and he had had his sword in a scabbard at his side. The sword looked used, but then he might have bought it used. They would have to look into that when they got out of town a ways. Analyst stood looking at Lanathan for a short time. Then finally he said, "Well, goodbye then." "Goodbye, Analyst. We'll see you when you get back." Jakath contented himself with bowing, then took the reins of his horse and began to lead him away. Analyst followed him. He was pleased to see. Perhaps there wouldn't be a lot of trouble with that young man then. Perhaps there wouldn't be a lot of trouble with that young man then. Enunciating. It's my friend. They went down to the market where they bought the supplies for the trip. Jakath didn't try to get anything fancy, nor had there been time to make any arrangements with any of the merchants. He had indeed expected Analys's master would have seen to the provisions already. Not that there would have been any respectable amount of money to be made out of provisions for two for a trip of this length, but Jakath wasn't a man to turn down even a few coppers if they could be had without undue risk. Very shortly they were on their way. They were on their way out of the main gate of the city. Once they had gotten out of the crowds and were in no danger of anyone overhearing, Jakath asked, How much money is on the pack horse, Analyst?" Analyst gave him a puzzled look, which rapidly turned into one of suspicion. "Look, Analyst, all I want to know is how likely it is for someone to be lying in wait for us." "But no one knows," the boy protested. "Look, lad, even if your master counted the money out himself and loaded it on the horses with his own hands, he was probably seen by several people, any of whom might guess what he was about. And any of those people might have a friend who would pay for the information. Or perhaps someone might just say a word in the wrong ear, and before you know it, someone would be looking for us. It might be helpful to know just how hard they'd be looking." Analyst frowned as he thought that one over. Then he said, grudgingly, 200 silver ponies." Jakath nodded. "It's enough. We're going to have to pay attention to what goes on around us. Don't worry. I don't expect you to notice all the worrisome signs, but I'll give you a few hints as we go on. And tonight, when we stop, I want to see how good you are with that sword. It might not hurt for us to do some regular practice anyway, just to keep you sharp. And for now, let's just enjoy the ride." He wasn't trying to scare the boy unnecessarily either. He'd known of just such cases he'd described, of employees selling information to bandits, and in an added complication that was that if he, as a bodyguard, happened to survive, it might get him the sort of reputation he didn't really need. He readied himself to notice what was going on. Sorry. He readied himself to notice who was on the road ahead of him and behind them, and put on a, a double watchfulness whenever they came to any place in the road that looked suitable for an ambush. how did I lose that? We don't have to worry too much this close to Ifan Sur, he told Anlis. Magistrates and the city council see to it that the bandits don't operate in their territory. But on the other hand, some bandits might just count on that atti- attitude to make us careless, particularly if they have inside information and know that they can make a good haul and light out for some small far part of the kingdom. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. I'm just stumbling today. The boys seemed to be paying close attention to this, and Jakath decided that he could play the wise advice giver pretty well all, all the way to Yath Hawar and back. If he worked things right, by the time they got there, young Anlis would be well on the way to becoming a fellow warrior, which would make it more possible to turn over some of the watching to him, particularly at night. There were a few suspicious types on the road, but then there always would be. He kept an eye on them, just in case. There were two ways of dealing with the situation. You could let them get well ahead of you, where they set up a proper ambush, or you could wear out your horses trying to stay ahead of them. And as you hurried up the trail, you'd probably find another band or two of the same sort, which would mean you'd have to pass them too. After a couple of days of that, your horses would be so worn down that if the situation ever arose, you wouldn't be able to run away from them. That meant watching out for all the places where someone might lay an ambush. It was a little tedious, but better than risking an arrow in your gut. When they camped that evening, he tested Analys's ability with the sword. He was pleasantly surprised to find that the boy was very good at the technique, though he seemed to look at it as a game. After the winner scored 3 touches, they'd all go wash off the sweat and have a drink together. He talked to him about that. You're good, boy. Very good. He cursed himself inwardly for letting slip the derogatory boy, but continued without a break. You've got near all the technique, though I'll teach you some sneaky tricks to go along. But you're not taking it nearly seriously enough. You see, if we come to actual fighting, it's not going to be those 3 touches and then we all rest. It's going to be fighting. It's not going Sorry, it's not going to be 3 touches and then we all rest. It's going to be more like 2 touches and someone's dead. If you haven't got that down, the dead one is likely to be you. You understand? Analyst's eyes narrowed a bit at the boy comment, but he seemed to follow what Jakath was saying despite that. They had another bout, and this time he attacked more and fiercely. When this one was done, Jakath felt it was necessary to give him a little praise. That's a little better, but still not as good as it might be. We'll work at it. And I reckon within 2 weeks we'll have you trained right and ready. He said nothing about what might happen if they were attacked by bandits sometime before that 2 weeks. On the second night out, he began to tell stories about his exploits as an adventurer. A lot of it was to try to get analysts to see what kind of thing they could get into, what he might have to be ready for. He hadn't much use for people who bragged about their travels and mighty deeds. He hadn't even he even convinced analysts to make a try at throwing a knife. Though the boy seemed unable to master the art beyond a very minimal effort. For all Chakath's care and attention, or maybe because of it, they were not ambushed. On the fourth day out, between the towns of Darsaka, Darsaka and Rothahan, they saw a band of goblins at a distance. There were 10 of them, armed and armored in various fashions, and they were on a route which paralleled the road. Spotting them, Jakath brought Annalis's attention to them. See them there, Annalise? We're going to have to be particularly watchful tonight and tomorrow. But goblins aren't usually careful planners. If they were coming for us, they'd probably be headed in our direction right now. I thought they preferred to go by night. Jakath pursed his lips. Well, to a certain extent they do. But you see them over there? So that means that you can't count on them to always be going by night. We're going to have to keep a careful watch for the next couple of nights to make sure, just to make sure. Amlos nodded in agreement. But there was no sign of the goblins that night or the next. They had been camping outside the towns along the way. Amlos asked Jakath about this. We have the money. We could afford an inn from time to time. The only trouble is that people in towns are not necessarily always honest. A pack like that on a horse might make some stable hand nosy, and before you know it, they're sneaking in to cut our throats while we lie comfortably in bed. Just outside the town of Sandanar, they camped again for the last time before coming to Yathar. In the morning, they broke camp, packed up, saddled their horses, and were just getting ready to mount up when there was a sound of rushing hoofbeats and shouting. 5 ragged men on horseback came rushing out of the brush at them. Dun, dun, dun. Chapter 5. Endless. In some place in the back of his mind, Anless was pleased to find that his sword was in his hand at the sound of the first shout. He immediately saw that one of the bandits was coming for him. The other was coming for Jakath, and rather than standing still and waiting, he moved. The bandit's sword was raised, and Anless took a sudden jump to his own left, forcing the bandit to swing his horse and strike downward across his own body. Anless parried and struck down. Whoops. Anless parried the blow, and without a thought, thrust his own sword home. He turned. The bandit who had attacked Jakath was dead, but the others were nearly back in the bush, taking the pack horse with them. He looked around for his horse. The animal was dancing nervously by the remains of the fire, disturbed by the noise and commotion. It took several tries before Anless could bring the animal under control. He was about to swing up onto the horse when Jakath called. Where are you going? After them. They've got the money. Indeed they have. But think about it a bit. For a scruffy band such as that, this is a rather shrewd and simple plan. They come down at just the right moment. While 2 of them are keeping us busy, the others run off the pack horse. I don't know how you feel about it, but it seems to me someone's thinking. And I'd wager that they'll be ready for pursuit. Archers in ambush along the way, I'd say. You just gonna let them get away with the money then? Demanded Amlis. No, I didn't say that either. Just give them a little while to think they've gotten away with it. Then we go track them down. Amlis realized the sense of what Jakath was saying, but even so, he couldn't help but feeling that he ought to do something. Go easy now, Amlis, said Jakath. Go easy. Clean up your sword and relax. You know it's not going to do any good rushing off into the hills into an ambush. And if you think your reputation is in trouble here, think about mine. I was supposed to be guarding against just this sort of thing. Alice forced himself to relax. He tethered his horse and, following Jakath's advice, cleaned off his sword. He glanced from time to time at the man he'd killed, thinking about how he had moved almost automatically. He recognized the results of Jakath's constant drills. He noticed Jakath looking at him. You did fairly well there, Amlis, particularly for having been taken by surprise as we were. My teaching must be worth something then. He forced himself to smile slightly. Yes, I suppose it was. I didn't have time to think about it. I just moved. Jakath nodded. That's the way it is. You drill long and hard enough, then your body makes the appropriate moves before your mind can catch up to it. You sound as though you've had some sort of plan for dealing with with these bandits. The warrior shrugged. If you want to dignify it by calling it a plan, I suppose I do. You see, this lot have either been watching us for a while, or they've had some inside knowledge from someone. I'd say they've just been watching us. Otherwise, they'd probably come down on us a long time ago. This means even the ones they leave sitting in the bush with bows to ambush us won't be too eager won't be too eager at their jobs. And if we give them a couple of hours, they'll probably all be heading in to get to the camp before the sharing out is done. After all, they won't be trusting each other much more than you or I would trust one of them. So we give it a couple hours and then we start out after them. And we take it a bit easy because some of the ones sitting in ambush might be a little more responsible than others. And with any luck, we'll sneak up on them while they've still got their minds on sharing out and hit them just as much a surprise as they hit just as much by surprise as they hit us. How many do you expect? And Jagath shrugged. Impossible to say. These 5 may have been the whole lot, and there might be 20 more like them back home. We're just going to have to be more careful about this. And what happens if we can't get the money back? Jakath smiled, a thin, slim hint of humor. Then we're in serious trouble. But suppose we deal with one disaster at a time, eh? Analyst wanted to blurt out that all his concerns and fears, but he had a feeling that Jakath was worried enough about himself and would probably not take well to being pestered. He looked around for something to do. The sun had barely moved an hour's worth of distance, though it felt like half a day, when Jakath finally said, Well, let's be going. And let me warn you once here that this is my kind of work. And when I tell you to do something, you'd better be ready to do it then, not argue about better ways about things. All right? All right. As far as Analyst was concerned, he doubted if they had any chance of recovering Lanathan's silver on his own. So the only thing he could do was to put himself in Jakath's hands. And Jakath had expressed his own concern about the reputation he might get from losing the money, but surviving himself. So he had a stake in it too. As they rode, Jakath talked. For the first few minutes, they'll be more concerned with putting distance between us than hiding their tracks. And anyone who could follow them. In a while, though, they'll start getting tricky. I'm no expert tracker, but I've done a bit and watch other people. So I figure that unless they have somebody who really knows his business, we should be able to find them. Indeed, it was, pardon me. Indeed, it was only a little later that the tracks had become harder to see and harder to find. As they rode, As they rode, Jakath muttered little phrases half to Analyst and half to himself. Ah, see that? They ride along the falling log, hoping to hide their tracks. Maybe they didn't know what they're doing. Maybe they don't know what they're doing properly. And, this is harder ground. The horses leave a little trace, but still. And still later. See that little streak on the rock there? Made by a horseshoe. So they've gone by here. It occurred to Alice that if he could remember all the little things that Jakath was saying, he'd know something about tracking. On the other hand, what did a scribe need to know about tracking? Twice Jakath went forward on foot while Analyst held his position to come forward on Jakath's signal. The second time he was smiling. He waited there, all right. I don't think he left very long ago either, and he hasn't been particularly careful about his tracks. I suppose he decided we weren't coming, so he needn't bother. Shortly after that, Jakath warned, "Careful now. I think we're getting close. They'll probably have some guards out somewhere, but I bet their guards have their minds on more on the pack horse than what's on their back trail." Twice more again he left Analyst while he went ahead to reconnoiter. The third time, when he left Analyst, the third time when he called Analyst forward, Analyst found him standing over a dead man in the bush. Careful now. They're just over the ridge there. It's a matter of picking the right time and going after them. How many? 6 of them. But we'll have the advantage of surprise if we use it right. How? Probably much of the same way they did it to us. I wish we had a couple of bows to pick off from a few from a safe distance. But we might as well wish for a couple of sleep spells while we're at it. First, I want to have a good look at the situation. Then I'll make some sort of plan. I'm afraid that the plan is going to consist of moving very fast, attacking like madmen before they find out how few we are, packing up the silver, and getting out of there. Now you wait here while I take a closer look at things. Manlis felt a bit as though he was balancing on top of a narrow well in a high wind. He was depending on Jakath for a plan to get Lanathan's silver back, and Jakath was as much as admitting that didn't really have a plan. And Jakath was as much as admitting he didn't really have a plan. And as far as Analyst was concerned, he himself had even less of a plan, so his whole future was depending on this. There being no real useful alternative, he awaited while Jakath went carefully up the slope. It seemed a long time, but the sun had only moved a short distance across the sky when Jakath was back. 6 of them. I have a feeling that the whole band is bigger, but some of them have gone out for some reason or other. And besides that, we've killed 3 of them. Come up here with me. I want to show you how I plan to do this. So it happened that very shortly after, Analyst was mounting his horse and drawing his sword. Jakath looked at him, raising a hand. Analyst, wondering how a peaceful scribe could get into this situation, nodded. Jakath brought his hand down, kicking the horse's ribs, and Analyst, wondering if he was as big a fool as he thought, did the same. There were three roughly built shacks down in the clearing, and 3 roughly dressed men going about what seemed to be usual camp tasks. One of them was busily plucking a chicken, one was cutting firewood, and a third seemed to be doing something with a tack for several horses. Considering the wood axe, an immediately available weapon, Jakath had assigned himself to the man cutting firewood. The man plucking the chicken was the closest, so Analyst had been assigned to that one on the ground, because he probably wouldn't be able to get the weapon out soon enough to do any good. Knowing just how good he was with a sword from horseback, though, Jakath had given him some lessons from time to time, and thus dealt with his target as carefully as possible. Like the other 2, the man looked up stupidly as the horses galloped toward them. Almost at the last minute, he tossed the fowl away and came to his feet, reaching for his sword as he tried to dodge. He dodged Analys's right, and Analys hauled the horse over that in that direction, swinging his sword as he came into position. He realized he swung a little late. Sorry, he realized he swung a little late, though. He felt the blade go home. So, wow, that's no. He realized that he'd swung a little late, though he felt the blade go home, and he swung the horse around rapidly to come back. The bandit had fallen, but he was trying to get up again, and Analyst directed the horse over in that direction again and leaned down out of the saddle to strike again. Again he felt the blade hit home, but he turned again to be sure, remembering some advice Jacath had taught him a while ago. Try to make sure one man's down for good before you turn to another. Oftentimes you can't do that, but it's a good plan if you have time and space. Over the top of his own mind was telling the man, "Stay down, you fool, stay down." The man was lying flat on the ground, unmoving, and Alice was fairly sure he was dead. The next thing was to jump down to make sure. His mind took in the firewood chopper, lying over his firewood with the black hilt of a throwing knife protruding from his throat. The other was lying a little ways from where he'd been working at the tack, and he seemed dead too. Analyst found himself thinking, I should work harder at learning how to throw a knife. Immediately on the heels of that came the thought that the scribe didn't need to know how to throw a knife. Jacath's voice made him aware of what he was doing, or rather, not doing. Don't just sit there, Analyst. We have to check the building to see if there's anybody else around. Move it. He jumped off of the horse and with one foot prodded the man he'd downed. If the man was faking death, he was doing a very good job of it. According to the hasty plan they put together, he rushed back up to Jacath, who was going into one of the shacks, sword in hand. Don't be so close behind me that I've got no room to move, but be close enough that you can help me, Jacath had said. Enough sunlight filtered in through the cracks. I'm sorry. Enough sunlight had filtered in through the cracks in the walls to allow them to see that there was nobody else inside. In one corner, they could see the pack from the pack horse opened. Analyst took a step toward it, but Jacath put a hand on his arm. Time enough for that when we've made sure we've got them all. The other two shacks were equally empty of human occupancy. When they went back to the pack to check its contents, they found 75 coins. Analyst looked up at Jacath, who shrugged. They started sharing out. Check everyone's wallets and see what we can find. Even checking the wallets did no more than bring them up to 80. At that point, they searched the whole camp to come up with and came up with coins of various sizes squirreled away here and there, bringing their total up to a shortage of 105. Well, said Jacath, pick up all the weapons. Pick up all the weapons. Take the horses. We may be able to make up the lack by selling Yathar. And we'd better get out of here. Someone's taken those missing silver ponies, and we don't want to be caught here when they come back. Dun dun dun. Oh, sorry about that. A little bit of stretch before I go into the last chapter. Jacath, chapter 6. Yathar was one of the cities where Jacath did not have good contacts. Had this been a Fatsur, or even Nori Lantam, he might have gotten better prices for the spoil of the bandits. As it was, even he had to admit that the horses were barely worth the trouble of taking them to the city, and only one of the weapons was in particularly good shape, a short dagger. As for the rest, this band had obviously not been very successful in their raiding. Either that or they'd spent their money on other things. He did the best he could, with analysts in the background looking like a man hiding a gut wound. But the best he could do was bring their total up to 160. Turning away with the money, he pointed his chin toward a less crowded part of the market, then headed in that direction, with analysts trailing behind him in a black despair. They reached the point of calm at the edge of the hurrying market. When they reached the point of the calm at the edge of the hurrying market, Jakath stopped and turned. Analysts hadn't gotten any happier. What now, Jakath? Jakath shrugged. We take in what we have and explain the circumstances. What are they going to do? Accuse us of stealing 40 silver ponies? Doesn't it make more sense if we were going to steal, we'd have taken the whole lot and disappeared altogether? I suppose so, but he didn't seem to feel any happier about the whole thing. They found Glanthus, a tall, strongly built man with iron gray hair and stern expression. Alice turned over the letter of introduction from Lanathan and waited quietly while the other read it. Then he handed over the pack. We were attacked by bandits while just outside the city, sir. And though we managed to recover most of the money, I fear it is a little short. The stern expression did not alter. How did it happen? Jakath watched as analysts ran through the story of what had happened to them. He was pleased to hear that the boy, whatever he felt, gave the story in a steady fashion, not needing to suddenly stop to explain something that had gone on before. He was fairly proud of his ability to read people's expressions, but for the life of him, Jakath couldn't tell when Analyst was finished whether Glanthus believed a word of it. He continued to stare at Analyst, with the letter of introduction in his hand. So, well, given the time of day, we will put you up for the night before you go back to Fansur. The steward will see to you. The quarters they got, as near as Jakath could judge, were the sort that would have been given to servants who had let the master down somewhat. But they kept their weather off. They kept the weather off, the food was passable, and at least they hadn't been locked up as thieves. Analysts continued to be morose, and it might seem suspicious for Jakath to desert him at this point and go off on his own. So he did what he could do to cheer him up. Come on, analysts, let it be. We did it as well as we could, and no one's accusing us of theft. Go easy on yourself, lad. We were supposed to bring 200 ponies to the Glanthus, and we didn't. Maybe you can laugh it off and go find another job, but it won't be so easy for me. He made another attempt or two, but Analyst was in a bad state. Jakath shrugged. Perhaps when they got back out on the road again, he'd be able to make the lad see that he wasn't dead over 40 silver ponies. Analyst was right to a certain extent. The loss of even some of the money he was entrusted with would mean more to Analyst's employer than it would to anyone wanting to employ a swordsman. Even there, the matter was not altogether simple. Perhaps 8 out of 10 people would not have even heard that Jakath was involved in guarding some money that hadn't made it all the way to the rightful owner. And if it came right down to it, Jakath was fairly sure he could convince at least one of the remaining 2 that there were good and sufficient reasons why the money hadn't made it through. So when the time came for Jakath to hire out his sword again, he might or might not find the results of this trip to be a hindrance. The next day, Galanthus gave Annalus a sealed letter for Lanathan, which the boy took as though it were a poisoned snake. The two of them set out working their way out of the city on the way back to Efansor. There was little chance of their being attacked on the return journey, with an obviously unladen pack horse. But little chance did not mean no chance at all. So Jakath was able to push Anlus into some sword practice that that first night. Anlus had protested, muttering something about how it didn't much matter if he didn't survive the trip home, since he had nothing to return for. Very good, boy, very good. Your life is over, so you don't care what happens to it. But if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be on this trip myself. And I just assume you able to do your part if we get attacked. I have my own skin to worry about this too, you know. Despite his scolding and referring to Anlus as boy, Jakath was barely able to push him to any practice at all. In the course of that practice, he drilled him as hard as he could, reasoning that even if the work didn't take his mind off his troubles, it would at least make him sleep well enough that night the things might not look so bleak in the morning. And it did not seem to him that Anlus woke in a better mood the next morning, though there were times when Jakath was sure he'd been deluding himself. He took to telling stories about sorry, some of his adventures as adventurer, some of his treasures he'd gotten and spent in the course of those years, telling tales as much to keep the trip from being done in a complete silence as for any other reason. Even so, he tried to tell the tales straight, not making any of his part larger or smaller than it was, and it seemed that from time to time Anlus almost smiled. Still and all, it was a grim sort of journey. They were coming up on the town of Asan on a windy evening. Sure, I'm not sure what that word is supposed to be. That's okay. A blowy evening with a cold sprinkle of rain in their faces and a promise of more, right, more in the low black clouds. Chakath looked at the sky, then looked at Anlus. Enough of this. Let's take shelter at the inn before the night. Anlus looked at him blankly, as though he had suddenly started speaking Shandakranian. He spoke again. Look, Anlus, I know you haven't spent all the traveling money, and you will look at the weather. Do you think I want to spend the night in a wet camp with nothing to look at but your sour face? Let's at least be comfortable. But the cost. Hang the cost. Look, we delivered the money short by 40 silver ponies. Do you think the master is going to be any happier because you've saved him the cost of a night's stay at an inn? I doubt that. Now come on, let's come on. Now come on. Jakath wasn't absolutely sure what the result was going to be, but he headed off toward the buildings. If it came right down to it, he paid out of his own money and let Annalise freeze for the night. He was somewhat pleased. He was somewhat pleased then to hear Annalise pulling his horse in behind him. The inn at Asan, sorry, the inn at Asan was a solidly built old place with a recently renewed sign declaring it to be the merry donkey. Jacatha stayed there a time or two in the course of his wanderings, but he wasn't sure if the landlord would remember him or not. There were some times it was better that the landlord did not, though he was fairly sure he hadn't done anything out of order in the merry donkey. He talked to Amlis as they led their horses to the stables. I've heard some of the people insist on caring for their own horses wherever they are. Fine for them, I say. But then again, most times when the ostler skims his duty, word gets around, and the people begin passing the end by. So it makes good sense for the innkeeper to make sure that everything's right in the stables. Myself, I do take a look around, see how things look, then make up my mind. There's been a time or two where I did my own horse because it's true enough that oftentimes a venturer depends heavily on his beast and wants him to be in the best of condition. From the looks of this place, I'd say we don't have to worry too much. Endless muttered something about something Jakath didn't catch. Then they left their animals in the care of the ostler. The ostler was large, an arm's length taller than Jakath, wide and heavy muscled, and he smiled at them when he looked at the horses. He took them in charge, and they seemed to have no objections, following him willfully into the stables. They went into the common rooms themselves then, and Jakath looked around. There were a couple of merchants, a few local farmers, drinking a bit more than they ought, and in one corner a band of armed and armored men holding to themselves and seeming to pay little attention to what was going on. Jakath knew from experience that that was all it was, seeming. For for these were venturers, and venturers who survived very long always had a fair idea of what was going on. Hmm. As he approached, he revised his first guess that they were men, for it was actually a group of four men and a young woman. He might have called her a girl for her years, but on her face he could see the lessons of experience. She carried light weapons, suited to her smaller build, and he was interested to see that she had at least three throwing knives on her. The others were a large fighter, heavily muscled with a lot of scars, who seemed like the sort who depended more on strength than skill, and a mage whose features defied description. There was something of the elves about them, and also hints of Shandakarian. But beyond that, it was hard to say. The others were a slender bowman and a youth, obviously newly joined. They looked up at Chakath. They looked up as Chakath approached them, dragging Amlis in his wake. None of them looked particularly welcoming, which was normal. Sorry. Venturer groups tended to get very weary of people, coming up with various aims in mind. Some attempted to attach themselves to the group. Some sat down for gossip. Some attempted to, sorry, some sat down for gossip, then used whatever information they gathered to slip in and grab whatever treasure the group was aiming for. Others just wanted to scrounge drinks. Jakath attempted to ease their minds on the last score by dropping a coin on the table and calling for the landlord. With your leave, sirs and madam, might we join you? We're on our way to Ifansur. The weather is miserable and we could use some company. The group sat there, looking at the two of them, until finally the heavy fighter nodded. Have a seat, fellow, and introduce yourself. My name is Jakath, and my companion is Endless. We've just finished making a delivery to Yathauer for a merchant. There was no sense in describing just how badly the delivery had gone. The fighter indicated himself, the mage, the bowman, and the youth in turn. I'm Helcas. This is Veldar, Nisamos, Devath, and our newest member, Zaldin. Have a seat, Chakath and Analyst. Join for a bit. So they sat and talked, mostly about other times and other places, treasures they had gotten or almost got, people they'd known, who was alive at the last hearing, who was dead, and even on occasion, who was retired. Chakath himself never tried to bring up the subject of where the band was headed, but Helcas did say they were headed off to the northwest, and that they had had a goal in mind. They talked of the other things as well. Have you heard, Jakath, that the king is becoming more stringent on requiring ventures to have warrants? I've heard the rumor, yes. The big fighter grimaced. More than a rumor, I can assure you. What it is, of course, is that the king needs more money, and requiring venturers to acquire and pay for warrants is one way to get a little money without having the ordinary people too upset about raising taxes. Chakath snorted. I wouldn't mind the cost of the warrant if it wasn't for the cost of paying all the officials until you come to the one who has the right to issue warrants. Would you go out without a warrant, then? He considered that one. No, probably not. To do that gives too much room for petty lording to harass you out of his territory. All I would say is that I begrudge the time and trouble it takes to get a warrant to go off to do the kinds of things they want us to do, to control the spread of the goblins, to kill off the giants, dragons, and other creatures of the wild. And, make no mistake, they want us out there, Helcas. They're just taking advantage of the situation to make a little more money out of us. They discussed that situation for a while, coming to no real conclusion. Nobody tried to organize adventures to refuse to go out unless warrants are freely given. That was a futility for sure, given the nature of the venturers, with none willing to let some other tell him what to do. And they talked about this and that as well, though Jakath noted that Helcas said nothing about the group's destination. He noticed another thing as well, that Annalise was a little taken with the woman, Veldar. She was putting on the face that said she wasn't interested in anyone just now. Though Jakath told himself he could probably interest her if he'd had the time and inclination. But to do that right now would do no good to Annalise, and he wasn't looking forward to explaining that the present situation to Lanathan, without having to explain as well how Annalise had killed himself for what he thought was love on the trail back. He could almost read Annalise's thoughts, how he wanted to approach this woman, but in the present situation he wasn't worthy of her, having failed so miserably. And her expression was probably seen by Annalise as a challenge, a statement that no one could but a hardy man among men could have a chance to do more than look at her. At last the company broke up and everyone went to their own beds. In the morning they had their breakfast and Helcas's band set out on their way. Jakath and Annalise set out in the opposite direction, and Jakath noticed that his companion looked back from time to time. He took this as a good sign. He had long since worried that wondering whether or not he could deliver Annalise alive back to Fansor. As the day wore on, Annalise settled back into his old gloom once more, and by nightfall, Jakath found himself seriously wondering whether the boy would live to get back to the city. All he could do was keep talking, keep trying to get the boy to respond, and to watch him carefully. Thanks to Tran and Viron, we're near enough to the city that we won't have to worry too much about keeping watch at night, he muttered to himself. If he decides to kill himself in the middle of the night, it's not likely going to be fatal to me, too. Doing his best to lift the boy's spirits, he broke his rule and told him of the tale about the cursed treasure of Shandakar. Anla seemed to take a little bit of interest in that, so Chakath said with a grin, "If all else fails, the two of us might get together to go after it. I was hoping that this job would earn me enough to finance the trip, but..." He suddenly broke off, realizing where the conversation was going. "It's time to turn in. You take first watch tonight, and you can make sure to wake me when it's time. We're close enough to the city that we ought to be safe, but there's no sense in being too careless." Analyst mumbled some sort of assent, and Chakath took to his bed. He was hoping that putting the boy on first watch with the responsibility of waking him for the second watch would keep him from his thoughts of suicide. He knew that late watch, the one between midnight and dawn, was the one where a person's thoughts tended to turn bleak, and to have Analyst wake at that time was not a good idea. Analyst woke him for his watch, going silently to his bed and leaving Chakath alone with his own thoughts. He knew that if it weren't necessary to deliver Analyst back to Ifansor, he would have made an excuse to leave him behind long ago. He was a drag on the spirits, and no amount of talking sense to him could shake him from this apparent feeling that his life was over. The next day they rode into Ifansor, and Analyst seemed to have drawn from somewhere the determination to carry through to the end, though he looked ghastly pale. They rode to Lanathan's house, left their horses in the care of the servant, and went to see the master. He smiled briefly, the smile changing to a frown when he saw Analyst's face, and he knew something was wrong. Taking the letter from Lanthas, he scanned it briefly, then looked up at the two. "So, what's the story then?" With an expressionless face, he listened to the tale of the bandit encounter, of the tracking down and attacking the bandits and recovering what they could of the money. He turned to Jakath. "You were present. You were to prevent this sort of thing." Jakath shrugged. He knew how it was going to go now, and all he could do was prevent Lanathan from having the pleasure of seeing his disappointment. "I was there to discourage that sort of thing. If you wanted it prevented, you ought to have hired 20 of us." The merchant gave him a long look. "Humph. Well, I hope you don't expect me to pay for the rest of your wages." "Of course not. We took the risk to recover what we could for you, when we could have just let it go. I have never expected any gratitude from you." Lanathan didn't seem to recognize the sarcasm. "Well, you can be off then." He turned to Annalise. "You don't look as though you're much of a use to me either. Take the rest of the day off and come back in the morning." Having dismissed them, he turned and went inside. Jakath looked at Annalise, decided he had no more responsibility there, then headed off down the street. If he were lucky, he might find a few others who could scrape together the money between them to go after the treasure. And there we go. That is 3 more chapters. Sorry, I'm so tongue-tied tonight. I do apologize. But thank you everybody for tuning in, and I will talk to you all again tomorrow with another 3 chapters. So, till then. Night.